History flows like a river. Tell us what happened today in history.
The first World Expo was held in London, England, on May 1, 1851. The exposition mainly showcases the economic achievements and cultural traditions of the participating countries, and does not directly engage in trade activities. The pavilion is built in Hyde Park in central London. The exhibition lasted for more than 5 months. More than 10 countries participated in the exhibition and it was open to the public. The number of visitors reached 6.3 million. The expo will bring great economic and social benefits to Britain. At Manila Bay in the Philippines, the U.S. Asiatic Squadron destroys the Spanish Pacific Fleet in the First Battle of the Spanish-American War. Nearly 400 Spanish sailors were killed and 10 Spanish warships wrecked or captured at the cost of only 6 Americans wounded. The Spanish-American War had its origins in the rebellion against Spanish rule that began in Cuba in 1895. The repressive measures that Spain took to suppress the guerrilla war, such as herding Cuba's rural population into disease-ridden garrison towns, were graphically portrayed in U.S. newspapers and inflamed public opinion. In January 1898, violence in Havana led U.S. authorities to order the battleship USS Maine to the city's port to protect American citizens. On February 15, a massive explosion of unknown origin sank the Maine in the Havana harbor, killing 260 of the 400 American crewmembers aboard. An official U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry ruled in March, without much evidence, that the ship was blown up by a mine but did not directly place the blame on Spain. Much of Congress and a majority of the American public expressed little doubt that Spain was responsible, however, and called for a declaration of war. In April, the U.S. Congress prepared for war, adopting joint congressional resolutions demanding a Spanish withdrawal from Cuba and authorizing President William McKinley to use force. On April 23, President McKinley asked for 125,000 volunteers to fight against Spain. The next day, Spain issued a declaration of war. The United States declared war on April 25. U.S. Commodore George Dewey, in command of the 7-warship U.S. Asiatic Squadron anchored north of Hong Kong, was ordered to capture or destroy the Spanish Pacific Fleet, which was known to be in the coastal waters of the Spanish-controlled Philippines. On April 30, Dewey's lookouts caught sight of Luzon, the main Philippine island. That night, under cover of darkness and with the lights aboard the U.S. warships extinguished, the squadron slipped by the defensive guns of Corregidor Island and into Manila Bay. After dawn rose, the Americans located the Spanish fleet, 10 out-of-date warships anchored off the Cavite Naval Station. The U.S. fleet, in comparison, was well-armed and well-staffed, largely due to the efforts of the energetic Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, who had also selected Dewey for the command of the Asiatic Squadron. At 5:41 a.m., at a range of 5,400 yards from the enemy, Commodore Dewey turned to the captain of his flagship, the Olympia, and said, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." 2 hours later, the Spanish fleet was decimated, and Dewey ordered a pause in the fighting. He met with his captains and ordered the crews a second breakfast. The 4 surviving Spanish vessels, trapped in the little harbor at Cavite, refused to surrender, and at 11:15 a.m. fighting resumed. At 12:30 p.m., a signal was sent from the gunboat USS Petrel to Dewey's flagship, "The enemy has surrendered." Dewey's decisive victory cleared the way for the U.S. occupation of Manila in August and the eventual transfer of the Philippines from Spanish to American control. In Cuba, Spanish forces likewise crumbled in the face of superior U.S. forces, and on August 12 an armistice was signed between Spain and the United States. In December, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the brief Spanish-American War. The once proud Spanish Empire was virtually dissolved, and the United States gained its first overseas empire. Puerto Rico and Guam were ceded to the United States, the Philippines were bought for $20 million, and Cuba became a U.S. protectorate. Philippine insurgents who fought against Spanish rule during the war immediately turned their guns against the new occupiers, and 10 times more U.S. troops died suppressing the Philippines than in defeating Spain. On this day in 1915 in The Hague, Netherlands, the International Congress of Women adopts its resolutions on peace and women's suffrage. The Congress, also referred to as the Women's Peace Conference, was the result of an invitation by a Dutch women's suffrage organization to women's rights activists around the world to gather in peaceful assemblage during one of the most divisive and intense international conflicts in history, World War I. It included more than 1,200 delegates from 12 countries, including Britain, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Poland, Belgium and the United States. Starting with two basic assertions, that international disputes should be handled by pacific means and that women should have the right to exercise their own vote in government, the International Congress of Women called for a process of continuous mediation to be implemented, without armistice, until peace could be restored among the warring nations. By continuous mediation, the delegates meant that a conference of neutral nations should be convened that would invite suggestions for settlement from each of the belligerent nations and submit to all of them simultaneously reasonable proposals as a basis of peace. Their resolutions, announced at the close of the Congress on May 1, endorsed measures designed for international cooperation, including an international court and a so-called Society of Nations, general disarmament and national self-determination. The delegates included a specific call for women to be given the vote, since the combined influence of the women of all countries is one of the strongest forces for the prevention of war, and since women can only have full responsibility and effective influence when they have equal political rights with men, this International Congress of Women demands their political enfranchisement. The Congress founded the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom (WILPF), an organization that still exists today. The first president of the WILPF was Jane Addams, the leader of the American delegation to the Congress and the co-founder of the Chicago social service organization Hull House. Addams and other delegates met with U.S. President Woodrow Wilson during the summer of 1915, knowing that the success of their plan depended to a great extent on the president's agreement to initiate and lead mediation between the hostile nations of Europe. Though Wilson was sympathetic to the proposals of the Congress, he eventually moved away from the principles of mediation and towards military preparedness and eventual U.S. entrance into the war in April 1917. Printed in English, French and German, the resolutions of the International Congress of Women were distributed to European heads of state in early May 1915. The Congress also determined that a delegation of women would be sent to meet with representatives of the belligerent governments to plead the cause of continuous mediation. To that end, 30 delegates toured Europe between May and June 1915. Though its arguments did little to sway the leaders of the warring nations, the proposals introduced by the Congress are still used today as guidelines for many diplomatic negotiations between hostile nations. On May 1, 1945, Nazi war criminal Goebbels committed suicide. Goebbels, born in 1897 in a Catholic family in Germany, has a disability in his legs. He studied literature and history at Heidelberg University and received his Ph.D. in 1921. Joined the Nazi Party the following year. In 1926, he was appointed as the leader of the Nazi Party in Berlin-Brandenburg, and he was appreciated by Hitler. In 1929, he was appointed leader of the Nazi Party propaganda organization and played an important role in the Nazi campaign and Hitler's power. In 1933, he served as Minister of National Education and Publicity. In 1933, the Burning Book campaign was launched, burning Jewish and Marxist books. Goebbels is good at making up lies and screaming. He touted Hitler, preached racism and advocated war. After the outbreak of the Second World War, the masses were encouraged to carry out wars. In the latter part of the war, no victory is destruction, and they refused to surrender. In April 1945, before the fall of the Nazis, he had been accompanying Hitler in the basement of the heads of state, and was married. Hitler was appointed prime minister before committing suicide. On May 1, Goebbels poisoned his 6 children and let the SS shoot him and his wife. Today, 58 years ago, on May 1, 1961, the lunar calendar March 17, 1961, Cuban leader Castro abolished the electoral system. On May 1, 1961, Cuban leader Fidel Castro shouted to the fanatical crowd, "Do you need an election?" The crowd burst into a "No" scream. In this regard, Castro announced that political officials will no longer be elected. He also told his people that Cuba had formally formed an alliance with the Soviet Union and joined the communist group. Facing the parade and the flag of Karl Marx, Castro said in his May 1 speech, "If Kennedy does not like socialism, then we also dislike capitalism." Today, 24 years ago, on May 1, 1995, lunar April 2, 1995, the United Nations decided 1995 as the International Year of Tolerance. From May 1 to 4, 1995, UNESCO and the Indian Ministry of Culture hosted the Asia-Pacific Regional Conference on Tolerance in New Delhi. The meeting focused on tolerance and discussed issues such as the economic, political, social and cultural status and prospects of the Asia-Pacific region. The meeting called on people to undertake the following obligations: respecting the political, religious and socio-cultural values of others and the right to make appropriate reforms of traditional practices, opposing the use of violent means to resolve conflicts, working towards the ultimate establishment of a just society and the peaceful coexistence of mankind. The meeting drafted a final draft declaration for the 1995 United Nations International Year of Tolerance. This draft declaration will be submitted to the UN General Assembly for discussion and adoption this year. The establishment of 1995 as the United Nations Year of Tolerance was proposed by UNESCO at the 26th General Assembly in 1991 and was endorsed by the UN General Assembly in 1992. It was used as an important event to commemorate the 50th anniversary of UNESCO. UNESCO pointed out that the survival of mankind requires a peaceful environment, and peace must be based on the rationality and morality of mankind. The concept of the Year of Tolerance aims to remind people to respect each other, treat each other as equals, be humbly and peacefully coexist. The General Assembly designated UNESCO as the organizing body for the Year of Tolerance to draft this draft declaration. In April 1993, UNESCO convened an expert meeting in Istanbul, Turkey. At the expert meeting held in Moscow from August 22 to 28 of the same year, the draft declaration was discussed and revised. This time, UNESCO entrusted the Indian government to host the Asia-Pacific Regional Conference, which finally completed the formulation of the draft declaration.